Today we are here with Warren Ross, former engineer for the Air Force, NASA, and General Electric, and he's going to share with us today his experiences with his career in Alabama.
Well, thank you, Gabriel, for the introduction.
When did you first know that you wanted to work for NASA?
Well, I actually first started to be a doctor. And when I was a young boy, I wanted to be a doctor. But a neighbor one evening came over and convinced me that I wanted to be an engineer because I was always fooling with model airplanes. And so he convinced me that I really should be an aeronautical engineer, which was the beginning of me getting interested in flying. And by the way, he mentioned also to me that they were going to go to the moon. Mm-hmm. So that's got me interested in, of course, aeronautical engineering. That's the start. Probably
wanted to be part of history too.
Well, I really didn't think of that so much as I loved airplanes, building model airplanes, mm-hmm. and of course I think I've told you that my mother used to give me a quarter to go to LaGuardia Airport as a kid. I'd go out there to LaGuardia Airport, 10-cent bus ride out, 10-cent bus ride back, and a nickel for a candy bar. And I'd go out there and watch the airplanes take off and land. So that was really the beginning of interest. But my family always said, well, you know, you want to be a doctor, and so I started to try to be a doctor. But my neighbor changed that. He convinced me that I needed to be an aeronautical engineer, which is exactly what I did.
When did you start working for NASA? And what was your job?
I started working for NASA in 1964, but before, 65, but before that, I was in the Air Force, and I was working on the Atlas missile program. But I started in 1965 in Huntsville, working on the Saturn V for the Apollo mission. The second job I had at NASA was a recovery system of the Saturn V system, and I was in a test group in the test area, and we worked on a model to recover the Saturn V. That was a very interesting program, a lot of fun.
Sort of like the Falcon 9 with SpaceX.
Well, yeah, it's a lot different, but the same idea, to recover the missile so it could be reused. And this was back in 1965, well, 67, excuse me. Yeah.
How long did you work there?
I worked there until 1968, and then I left and went to Houston with General Electric, working for NASA again, and this time doing thermal analysis on the spacesuit for the lunar walk. Mm-hmm. That again was an extremely challenging, interesting work.
What was your first mission at NASA?
Well, I never really had a mission at NASA because I wasn't an astronaut. I was an engineer, and I was working on, as again, at NASA in Houston, the thermal analysis for the spacesuit for the lunar walk. Quite a detailed analysis we did to be sure that the spacesuit would support the astronaut. The lunar environment is quite different than it is on Earth. There is no air on the lunar surface. Mm-hmm. So the suit has to be pressurized. It's also thermally hot on the moon when the sun is out. It can be as high as 270 degrees. So we have to monitor that and make sure that the spacesuit will support the astronaut and won't cause problems with melting of the visor and so forth, which would melt at 240 degrees. Mm. So that's why we did the thermal analysis. And it also, we did that so that we could ascertain the consumables, because they had consumables. They had oxygen, they had water for cooling, and so we had to be sure that the astronaut, that when he was out on the lunar surface, he would not use up all his oxygen and he would not use up all his water. Mm.
How do you think that your studying at the University of Alabama and getting your degree from there helped you with your career?
Well, it helped me tremendously, because that's how I got started. I mean, getting a degree in and back then it was aeronautical engineering, and when I graduated, they actually called it aerospace engineering. But by getting a degree, I was able to work in these different programs. You know, again, starting with the Atlas program at Cape Canaveral and going to Huntsville for the Saturn V program, and then going to Houston for the spacesuit.
Would you care to go into any more detail about the beginnings of the Saturn V mission to where you kind of left it, like where you were done with it?
Well, I left actually before the people completed it. I actually, when we did the first flight, the Apollo 11 flight, I was actually in Houston working on the spacesuit. But we were doing, we never did quite finish the flight sequencing and so forth, nor all the testing that we were doing. By the way, there's a part I didn't mention to you, which I'll mention to you. There was a very serious problem with the Saturn V as far as liquid depletion on the engines. If you depleted the oxygen or the fuel on the engines would tear up and the missile would fail. And so I was involved in a test and I never did complete it, someone else completed it, but I set up the system and the program so that we could deplete the liquid oxygen and see that we did not cause a problem with the engines ingesting a GOX bubble and tearing up the missile. One of the specific jobs I had was thermal analysis on the visor for the space suit. That was something they gave me that particular job. We wrote programs to analyze it because the visor could melt, as I mentioned earlier, at 240 degrees. And the temperatures on the lunar surface could get up to 270 degrees. And you surely don't want to melt his visor on the lunar surface. So we had to be sure that, a couple of things, we had to be sure that our analysis was correct, which we did by testing. And then once we knew what our analysis was, we were able to tell the astronauts when they could go out on the lunar surface and when they had to stay in the LEM. And basically, I can tell you that it was stay in the lunar excursion module, the LEM. Because above a 48-degree sun angle, temperatures could get out of hand. And so we limited the astronauts to a 48-degree sun angle. And we also limited them to the craters that they could go into because the craters were hot spots.
And the deeper the crater, the hotter
the crater, the hotter the thing. And if you went into a deep crater, he could melt his visor if it was hot in that particular crater. In fact, we actually had models, and we told the astronauts where they could go and where they had to stay out of. So if you were really paying attention to the TV, and they said, "Don't go into Edith" or "Don't go into Galileo" or something or other, the ground people were telling the astronaut, "Don't walk into that crater because it was too hot." And of course, they had them named, and the astronauts knew the names of the craters.
How would you say that your personal story and success can contribute to the theme, Alabama history, triumph and tragedy?
Well, in my case, I mean, I was raised in the streets of New York City. That was kind of a tragedy to start with. I was exposed to a lot of things. I even joined a gang at one time. But I realized that that was a dead-end street, and so I decided to improve myself. And fortunately, my parents were able to send me to college. And by going to the University of Alabama, I got a degree in aerospace engineering, as we've talked about. But I also had an opportunity, and the opportunity to be a success and to contribute to the space program.
I'd like to thank you for sitting down with me and talking to me about your personal triumph and success in starting with the University of Alabama and at NASA and General Electric.
Oh, you're quite welcome. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it. It was fun. And I hope that this discussion encourages students in your high school and in Alabama or wherever this program is taken to, if they have the desire, go get a degree in engineering. And if you really like aerospace, go get it in aerospace engineering.